Good evening, everybody. Thank you for coming out on this balmy November night. We're so delighted to see so many of you in the community here for the Graham and Sally Lusk lecture. This lecture series invites distinguished speakers, acclaimed artists, scholars, visionary thinkers in the field of art and creativity to engage and inspire audiences who wish to better understand and appreciate art from around the world and throughout time. The series was created in 2015 through an estate gift from Graham Lusk and honors both Graham and Sally's long-term commitment to the Joslyn Art Museum. I want to thank AIA Nebraska and Design Alliance Omaha for partnering with us tonight. Craig Dykers was first here in 2009, where he lectured at the Joslyn, brought here by Design Alliance Omaha. So welcome back, Craig. For over 40 years, Craig Dykers has followed a career of architectural thinking, focused on design as a promoter of social and physical well-being, supported by ongoing observation and the development of an innovative and sustainable design process. A founder of the international design firm practice Snøhetta in 1989, he has since established offices in Oslo, Norway, New York City, and several other studios globally. Dykers has led many of Snøhetta's most prominent projects internationally, including the Alexandria Library in Egypt, we just got back from, the Norwegian National Opera and Ballet in Oslo, the National September 11th Memorial Museum Pavilion in New York City, the San Francisco Museum of Art expansion in California, and more recently, the Theodore Roosevelt Presidential Library in North Dakota. In Omaha, he has led the design of the Joslyn Art Museum's expansion with his entire team, and we're looking forward to seeing all of that, aren't we? I have another page of notes, sorry here. Dykers' work has been awarded the Smithsonian National Design Award, the Aga Khan Award, the Mies van der Rohe European Prize for Public Architecture, and the World Sustainability Award. Craig has been interviewed by most of the world's leading media groups, and his work was listed by Fast Company magazine as among the top 30 of the world's most innovative companies. He is a fellow at the Royal Institute of British Architects, the American Institute of Architects, and a resident of the American Academy of Rome. Craig was born in Germany to American and British parents, and today resides in Brooklyn, New York, with his wife Elaine Molinaire, who is also an architect at Snøhetta and one of the founders as well. I can also just say that, anecdotally, that Craig is a great guy. He is passionate about the arts. He does think deeply about architecture and its role within daily life and its role within a community. He frequently talks about how institutions should create generous public space that we can give back to individuals so they can gather and where they can build community. I can say that he has brought his full creativity and his intellect to the Joslyn project, and Craig and every member of the Snøhetta team will be making an incredible contribution to our community. I can also add that Craig is great fun at the dinner party. So with that, Craig is going to address what is a museum now. Please join me in welcoming Craig to the stage.
Thank you. Nice. Oh my, that's wonderful. I've been coming to Omaha since the early 80s, actually, and it's nice to be amongst so many people who maybe I've met over the years, or colleagues in the industry, and people who helped support lectures that I gave here, for example, the Design Alliance, over all of this time. So for me, it was a great thrill to be commissioned to work on the Joslyn. I saw the Joslyn the first time, and like many people, were simply stunned by its magnificence. It's an exceptional building. It's a bit like as if you see the Sphinx for the first time. It's like, wow. This isn't going anywhere. I don't care if Napoleon arrives and tries to get rid of it. It's not going to happen. In that sense, it's been a thrill, and it's certainly a thrill to be here. My company is not named after a person, so Snøhetta is not an individual. So it causes some challenges, because every now and then people meet me and they say, well, where's the Snøhetta person? There's got to be a more important person than you. So, the name Snøhetta comes from a mountain. It's in central Norway. It's where Valhalla is located in Norse mythology. And that's a picture of the mountain there. So when people ask me about the Snøhetta person, I give them directions to this mountain. Probably don't see them again. as Jack mentioned, we have built our first project when I was 28 years old. We received a commission to revive the Great Library of Alexandria in Egypt, not the one in Virginia. Some people think about that. It was an amazing process. It took 13 years of more or less my entire life full-time and my colleagues working on this project. And just a few weeks ago, I was there to celebrate ostensibly the 20th anniversary of its opening, but because of COVID and other things happening, it was actually 22 years since it opened. So going to Alexandria with the full team was a magnificent feeling for me. As you know, the history of Alexandria and the history of the library, it's rather fascinating. Of course, Alexander the Great, who was Hellenistic, founded the town that we call, the city that we call Alexandria, over 2,000 years ago. He was from Macedonia, and he helped build one of the world's most interesting and important global empires for the time. I think he was 33 years old, I guess the same age as Jesus. That seems to be a time where you're sort of doing great things. I remember when we won the commission, I was 28, and I was like, I still got a few years left, so we'll see. But I went there with my colleagues, and it was just a thrill. And we walked onto the plaza after all this time, and there were just lines of people waiting to get into the building. It receives about 3,000 people a day, even at this time. It's a library, but it's also a museum. I'll talk about that in a moment. But there were young people from all over Egypt lining up to be in this place of learning and place of knowledge. It's just thrilling. And I know you're building a new library here in Omaha. These are very important buildings. In fact, one of the other things that I noticed was that young girls, young women, were participating in a new way in knowledge in Egypt, which when I started the project was almost inconceivable. But it's changed the way people see how they can interact and how they can respect social diversity. These were all young children looking at our little model of the library. When the library met the revolution in Egypt, which was in 2011, we were very concerned that the library would get burnt down. I mean, it had already been burnt down once, I think, by Elizabeth Taylor or Richard Harris or someone like that. But there was a great fear that this was the end of the new library. But the citizens of Alexandria formed a human chain around the library, arm in arm, pro-government and anti-government groups to protect this library. And it was just an astonishing story. And in fact, they made a children's book out of that event. And so somehow this library has held its own for nearly 2,000 years. And why is that? Why should it create such interest in time? When we were there, we gave a lecture to an audience of about 1,500 people to talk about how we designed the library, not dissimilar today, and to today here with you, some of our early thoughts and what it might mean to people. And it was really amazing to look out into the audience. And as you can see here, many young women there. It was amazing. And we actually now in the library, it has the largest percentage of women employed staff of any other cultural institution in Egypt. And that was a great feeling too, because the building is somehow a part of a hope for different groups of people. Well, the question is, how did a library survive, and why is that relevant to our discussion tonight, which is loosely entitled, What is a Museum Now? Well, the library at that time wasn't a library. In fact, they didn't have books. Books weren't invented until many, many years later. They only had handwritten scrolls in the ancient library of Alexandria. So we can't think of it in the same way that we might think of a library today. Furthermore, it was filled with sculpture and art and all the things that you would have in a museum. And there were also scrolls and scriptures. So that sort of structure had an influence on this question, what is a museum now? And having just come from Egypt, just come from Alexandria, and then coming here to give this talk, it was just powerful to me to understand that story. Because when you ask this question, what is a museum now? You first have to ask yourself, well, what's a museum? We think we know what it is. And, there are many kind of understandings of what they are today. But those understandings are a little unusual. Probably the two bookends, or the two extremes of this discussion, are the project on the top. I think that's the Met, probably. I used to have the British Museum up there. These are museums that are just bold temples, and they're powerful and they're big and not dissimilar to the Joslyn, but more classical. The Joslyn's actually an incredibly innovative traditional building, but if you go back to these kinds of buildings or the British Museum, in a sense, they sort of look like mausoleums. And I always got the feeling that, the idea is you go to a museum like the Met or the British Museum or anything like that, you walk in and the art is so powerful, it knocks you dead, and they don't have to take you out because it's already a mausoleum. Just slide you into another shelf somewhere. It feels like that, and that's because they're all about protecting, conserving, which is important. We're not going to discredit conservation. But if it overwhelms the capacity for a building to be human, then there's a question we have to ask ourselves. The other type of museum, which has become common in the last 20, 25 years, is the branded museum, the museum that's sculpturally impressive, that everyone wants to talk about, everyone wants to be there, and the art inside is almost secondary. Like, well, okay, I'm going to go in. Not only am I not going to be knocked dead, I'm going to walk out with a really great stride, like I saw this building. But you won't remember anything you saw there. So there are those two kind of ends of the project. So here's where I'd like to tell you a little bit about the history of museums. It's really a fascinating story in the West. I'm not talking about museums in Asia or in the East or other places in the world, but in the West, they primarily date back to something which is a part myth and part reality. And there were a cast of characters that are the essence or the core of how we began to understand museums. One of those is a Greek hero king called Theseus. He was a rather magnificent character, and if you read Greek mythology or Greek character mythology, you'll know that there are 25 stories for every character. You read one, it's this, you read one, it's that. There's never one story. The other one is, of course, Helen, who never existed. She was a woman only in people's minds, and every story about her tells a different component of our understanding of life. And then there's Castor and Pollux, who were also mythical creatures, mythical heroes and divine. You probably know Castor and Pollux because the constellation Gemini is these two brothers. They weren't twins, but they were very closely related. And the last person in this story is Academos, who was an actual real person, the only one in this story that's real. He was a general in Athens. And the story goes that Theseus, who was a kind of brutal king, even though he wasn't a real person, and this is only one story, he somehow wanted to prove that he was the most important person in the world. And Helen of Troy was considered the most perfect woman in the world, so he abducted her and took her to Athens against her will. And he imprisoned her as his sort of captive treasure. And this created a lot of problems for those people in Troy, including Castor and Pollux. And they were very upset because she came from Troy and she wasn't Greek. And they decided they were going to rescue her. So they sent Castor and Pollux to Greece. And they brought with them a massive army, an army the likes of the Greeks had never seen before. And they were on their way to Athens, and they were going to kill Theseus, and they were going to burn the whole city down. And as you can imagine, Athens at that time was a very beautiful and special place. So everyone was frightened they would lose everything that they had. And then comes Academos, this general. He was a soldier, a warrior. He was well respected for his ability to fight and win. So everybody talked to this general. You got to take care of these Trojans for us. We don't want them burning Athens down, and we can't get Theseus to give Helen back. So Academos, this great general, went to the Trojans secretly, and he told them where Helen was being held captive. And he said, I will tell you her location if you promise not to burn Athens down. So rather than fighting, he negotiated, and he saved Athens. and Helen was returned to Troy. It's a great myth and a great idea that this general, who could have fought, and he had an army, decided not to fight, and he saved really all of their heritage. Well, what happened after this event was eventually Academos died because he was not a hero or a god. He came from a small town on the eastern portions of Greece near the Adriatic, and when he died, he was so respected, he was so loved, that they made a burial place for him in a little meadow surrounded by olive trees, and any invading force or any kind of force that was trying to occupy Greece along the many years to come would go to that grave of Academos, and they would pay tribute to him, even though they were trying to do exactly what happened with the Trojans, and they would not touch that soil where he was buried because he was considered incredibly brilliant and filled with wisdom. So where does that lead us to a museum? Well, there's something called the Academy that came from this, where Aristotle and Plato and Socrates and all these great thinkers built a world of intellectual delight and understanding. The Academy is where an Academos, the Academy is named after Academos, and our world of academia comes from this general, still to this day, this great general in Greece. And they tried to recreate in Athens this grove of trees where Academos was buried. It's a beautiful thought, and they created several of those, and those became the academies of each of the great philosophical thinkers of ancient Greece that we still connect to this day. Those places were outdoor places. They didn't have a building, so the academy wasn't like a school or a library or museum. They were just places where they talked to each other. And if you know the history well enough, you'll know that some of them, like Plato and others, were wrestlers, and they were active, and they fought a lot, and they did all these things while they were talking, the origin of the universe. It's just a fantastic imagination that these people had. They did eventually build structures like the great stoas that you're probably aware of, but those were outdoor structures too. They only used them to kind of move. They would walk back and forth through these stoas talking about their thoughts of the world, and then they would slide outside into the gardens surrounding the stoa. So this is very important because our world began to be formed intellectually in the West by these consequences. And this is, of course, the great painting of the Academy in the Vatican. You can see everybody's like busy doing things. There's just stuff happening everywhere. This was the Academy in the ancient world. This was connected to something called the House of the Muses. Some people think that the House of the Muses is the source of a museum because they sound similar. But actually, if you look here, you can see in the little list, none of the muses represent painting or sculpture, even though they had painting and sculpture at that time. The muses represented literature and song and dance and all these joyful and tragic kind of arts that existed with the Greeks and eventually the Romans. Partly that's because art, meaning sculpture and painting, was considered so everyday, so normal, that you would never need a muse to represent it. And that's a kind of fascinating thought, so different from where we are. All of this led to, I'm coming back to Alexandria, the Library of Alexandria, which was never called a library in Greek. In fact, it was called the Museon, which is a word where our word museum derives from. And it was loosely associated with the muses, the great muses of Greek history. But it was a place where there were scriptures and books and sculpture and painting and all of these things where you could just expand your understanding. So a museum in the ancient world was a place where you saw art and a place where you could read scripture and a place where you could talk to a lot of people. That's where museums come from. That's our history. And if you don't understand that, you really can't make a museum now because you're ignoring all of those things that we used to develop this cradle of culture in history. Well, what happened to the great Library of Alexandria? It definitely was not burned by Julius Caesar in the way that we see in the movies. Many, many things happened. It was destroyed over a long period of time. But for me, the most important event in the destruction of the ancient museum or Library of Alexandria was the death of Hypatia. She was probably one of the world's great thinkers. She was an extraordinary individual. She understood the elliptical orbit of the planets. She built up an understanding of the geography of the Earth. She was a poet, and apparently she was incredibly beautiful, according to history. If you don't know about her, please read about her. She was a powerful woman. And there's the most famous story, and I'll try not to be too grotesque here, but all the boys in her classes loved her because she was apparently so beautiful. And she couldn't get them to listen to her classes. So apparently, this is a famous story, I'm not making this up. She had a female sanitary rag, and she pulled it out from under her dress and said, "Do you still love me?" So she was amazing. And, this is in 415 AD, so it's, a long time ago. But what happened to her, unfortunately, is at this time the Christians had taken over Alexandria. It had previously been Hellenistic and Egyptian. It involved the gods on multiple sources, but the Christians wanted one God, and she said, "I'll accept your God, that's fine, but I want my other gods too." And so they actually, unfortunately, killed her. They killed her, and they killed her in a brutal, brutal way. And that essentially ended the intellect of this great museon in Alexandria. It wasn't a fire, it was an attack on a great person. And from then on, the museon sort of disappeared. And what happened next was that museums sort of faded into history, and in the medieval ages and in the early Renaissance, they became libraries, which were essentially about maintaining power and maintaining access to knowledge. And the libraries had artifacts like art pieces, like paintings and other things, but they were strictly controlled. And that lasted for hundreds of years, for centuries, until the Renaissance and the late Renaissance. What happened next, in terms of the history of museums, is that very wealthy people started to accumulate art. And they were the ones who found value in the art, so they put it into their homes, and it became an extension of the religious component, where they would hold pieces of religious artifacts, like a fingernail of a saint or something like that, and this extended into art. But everybody wanted to see them, their friends wanted to see them, so they would invite people into their homes to show their great works of art. And the pressure grew and grew and grew until those wealthy people couldn't hold back all the people that wanted to see their collections. And they had to question what they would do. But they did continue this process well into the Victorian era. This is John Soane's home in London. And it became more and more eclectic, more and more a kind of idolization of different parts of the world, Italy or France or wherever, if you weren't from that location. And they then realized they have to make this more accessible. The public has to be able to see these things without ringing my doorbell every 15 minutes. So they created this concept of a museum that we understand today. And this essentially has remained unchanged for several hundred years. This is what most of us imagine a museum to be, if not this picture, but conceptually what it represents. It's a place that holds art very carefully, protects it, hides it behind a red velvet curtain, and if you're really good enough, they'll pull the curtain to the side and you get to walk in and experience all this stuff. And we have opened up museums a little bit in the last 100 years, but essentially many museums have been and still are like this. It's some kind of warehouse for art. Well, what happened next? What's happening now? So we can ask that question, what is a museum now? Because those ideas, some of them are important, but we can see that they led to a misunderstanding of what a museum is over time. So I'm just going to run through a whole bunch of things that have been happening in the last 30 years in museums, because when I say what is a museum now, I don't mean this second. I'll end with that. I mean what led up to this moment in time. So a museum is first of all and foremost to many people visitor numbers. It's like, how many people can we cram into a museum? And if we can get enough people in there, we're a good museum. And, it's horrifying kind of feeling because you're just behind all these crowds and you can't even see the works of art. You're just there because you're told you need to be there. That's one thing that happened. The next thing was that when they had all these people, they needed to give food. So museum became a cafe. And like, well, maybe the museum isn't so important as long as we have really good food. And people will come there. And the problem with that was that, of course, the museum started to smell like food. And, it really intruded on the notion of art. Well, when they got so many people, they think, well, damn, we need a gift shop. So we made gift shops everywhere in the museums, and some of them are gigantic. And it's not, I love gift shops, so don't get me wrong. I'm not trying to be critical in that way, because I always go to the museum gift shop. I even have my pin from Joslyn on tonight that I bought in the gift shop. So it's important, but it's also a problem. If the gift shop gets more powerful than the museum itself, it's hard to find your way through all that. Some museums took on the idea to be more positive, and they started to create a museum as a garden, which is a beautiful place that you can move through. And this is one of the few ideas that somehow goes back to the roots of the academy, when it wasn't even a building. It was just a grove surrounded by trees. And those sorts of things have been very positive. But of course, it's not necessarily a place where you can show paintings or works that need to be protected. So that can also overwhelm what a museum is. Weddings are super important, so let's have a lot of weddings in the museum. And the more weddings we have, we're going to be like more financially successful, and then we'll be a good museum. The positive side of this is that people who want to show their love in a museum is just a powerful statement. You just can't replace that. On the other hand, it can overwhelm, if you're not careful, the balance of what a museum is. So what happened was that museums started to create event space. And I call it event space, but it's really empty space. Because when a museum is not using it for a wedding or a gala or something else, and you build a purpose-built room for events, it sits there empty most of the time. So they'll close the doors and pretend it's not there. But intellectually, there's a gigantic room, probably bigger than any other gallery in the museum, that's sitting there empty. And that sucks energy out of the visitor. And I don't think this was a good move either for many, many museums today and leading up today. Events are great, but empty event space is not. Museums also took on the role of being community rooms, which is fascinating. Wonderful idea to be a part of a narrative of the people they serve. And one client of mine once told me a great lesson, which was when we were designing the museum, he said, I don't care about anybody except for those people that live 15 minutes from my museum. That's the only people I care about. And if they like it, the rest of the world will follow. And that's true also with community space in a museum, which we'll talk more about in the Joslyn. It's a powerful moment. Well, that's the sober and interesting side of it, but then we have to have fun again, so let's make date night at the museum. And a lot of museums now have like entrenched sort of programs to have date night, which is fun. I love it, but it's also one of those things that changes your perspective of where you are. It's great. I love it. Date night's great, but you just have to look at it from a slightly different way to see what it really doing to a museum, other than enjoying fun. And that's because museums are now focused a lot on party nights. You might have second Thursdays and things like that. Again, I love all this stuff, so I'm not saying no. I'm just asking us all to stop for a moment and look at that and see what the consequence might be, positive and negative, because there's certainly positive components to all of this. Many museums, and I'm sure Joslyn will be among them, become a fashion stage. Like, let's have a fashion show there, or let's do a fashion photograph shoot there. Let's be on the cover of a magazine, and that's also amazing. I've been to these things, and it's just incredible. But where is it going to? How does it change the gestalt of a museum? Some museums are so popular that they're basically just parking lots. So you have, 300 parking spaces in this tiny little museum over there with some buses going to it. That's another challenge that museums face today, the transition between very large parking areas and these beautiful, intimate experiences of connecting to art. Some museums have recognized that they need to go off-site from time to time. In other words, they find a way to take the art to other places other than their institution. These are really cool ideas because you get people who never thought they would see a museum's collection in their backyard. And in this case, it's just like a film or conceptual art film that's in a parking lot. and I think it was even in a Walmart parking lot or something, I can't remember. But it's an intriguing idea, but it's also a satellite, an extension of what a museum is. Mostly what we've seen in the development of museums really over the past 30 or 40 years is an understanding, best intentions, let's make our museum into a public space. You should feel so comfortable walking into the museum as if you had just walked across the street to catch a bus or something like that. It's part of the public realm. Great idea, great idea. But the problem is that it creates, in terms of public space as a positive thing, it also gives people the feeling that it is actually public space, even though it's not. And so as a result, you get museums as a space for public protest, things that they would never do. Could you imagine like people just coming into your house and having a protest just because you invite people over for dinner every now and then? You know, it's a strange idea that museums have now become the stage for public protest because people think it's okay, even though I don't think it is. And that has led, of course, to the museum as defacement, as we've seen often in the news now. People not only feel they can go and protest, they think they can just go in and rip a painting apart, like somehow it's theirs. And this is also a challenge that museums are facing. We're getting closer and closer now to what is a museum now. But one of the things we have seen over the years is because of the problem of defacement and damage to museums, we have to make museums into like Checkpoint Charlie in Berlin or something. Some museums are good at it, and the ones that aren't, it's a horrific experience. You walk in and you're like, I'm going to a museum, and then everybody wants you to like take your pants off and walk through a magnetometer and everything like that. Everybody has to get their purses checked. It completely kills the vibe. So, you know, there has to be ways to manage that too in a museum today. On the more happy side of things, museums have become a kind of scrapbook for people. You know, they go to a museum, they take all the pictures, they put their pictures in a scrapbook or in a story on Instagram or something like that. It's a kind of collection of memories for them. Sometimes those memories are profound, and other times they're momentary, and they're just about making a scrapbook. So this is another challenge that museums face today. Museums have, and beyond even that, they've become a kind of selfie target. You know, it's like, I don't even know that word, how it exists, but it does. And, you know, this kind of consequence of you needing to show your face in front of something. Maybe you never even turned around and saw it. It was just that. So this is a huge challenge for museum directors and museum administrations today, how they manage it. Because on one hand, it's like, well, gosh, we have to have that or people won't come. But at the same time, it's manipulating the culture. Because if you take it to the furthest extreme, a museum becomes an actual selfie museum. And this is happening now. There are people in museums around the world that their sole content is related to how many selfies you can take in a day. And they close everything down except for that. That's another strange kind of concept about what is a museum now. Beyond that, there's the ongoing challenge of museums as brand. And of course, by that, I mean the brand is so strong by some museums, I couldn't even put a picture of one up here because I'd probably get sued. So, you know, these are museums that try to represent their identity as their brand. And it turns the museum into a commodity, which is what they need because they sell their brand, but at the same time, it segregates or separates people from their actual offering of art and culture. There's now, and now we're almost near to the actual now, there's just weird concepts out there right now, which I call like museum as mirror. There's nothing in it. It's just you. And you go and you take your picture in front. It's not even like the other picture where you're taking your photograph in front of a beautiful painting. This is like some really weird garbage that you take a picture in front of, and that's the museum. And that's been transformed, and I'm sure all of you know about this, museum as fun park, which is that they're abusing the word museum, right? It's like the Museum of Ice Cream or the museum, some kind of immersive museum, which isn't really a museum. It's a place where you go to have a lot of fun. Again, I'm not criticizing it. I love these places too, and in fact, we designed a Museum of Sex in New York City, and it's filled with fun. But I'm only saying that because it's just something that's creeping into this 2,000-year-old history that I was talking about earlier. I'm guessing maybe at a certain level, if Plato or Aristocrates were alive today, they'd go to the Museum of Ice Cream and probably have fun. But still, it's something that is defining this world. Now, of course, we're almost to the current. You get museums as augmented reality. These are useful things that you can have a sort of iPad or some kind of computer pad, and you can hold things and get information or scan things and flip through them and take pictures or hold it up and see something. It's another kind of way of seeing. I'm not saying it's bad, but it definitely changes the physicalness of the experience, because your physical act is not going like this or going like this. I don't know about you, but I do that with paintings. I'm like, maybe I better look over here, But when you have augmented reality, it's just like, So it's a different kind of movement. And that has led to many other new sort of innovations in museum design. One is the museum as a virtual experience. I was recently in Long Island at the Jackson Pollock studio, and they had one of these things. I have to say I loved it. I mean, you got to walk into his studio and kind of be there, and you walk around, like pick up a painting. And, it was really great. But it was also it was okay in a way, but it started again to make me try to understand, why was I doing this? Why is it necessary? And I'm not being an old curmudgeon, although I guess I am. But I'm just trying to ask us to stop and take a moment to look. These have led to other kinds of new museums, which I would call museums of zero gravity. They don't really exist. You put on the things, or you look on your TV screen or your computer screen, and you move around, and you can mix and match paintings and do all these kinds of, make your own museum, which is cool. But again, it's a different kind of movement. Your body isn't moving. Generally, just a few components of your body are moving. Here's the last of this, which I think is probably going to happen pretty soon. This is the second to the last. Second to the last is they tried to make museums as holograms. It didn't succeed. So before augmented reality and before other types of technology, they would do projections of people in the museum or in the library, and they would tell you about things, but of course they're holograms, so they can't really easily walk around. So you kind of have to listen to them, and they looked kind of spooky like ghosts, so they weren't very popular. But I remember working on a project a number of years ago where they tried to introduce that, and it just failed. Now here's the last slide. Museums of artificial intelligence. This is what I guess might happen in the next few weeks. You might have a situation where you're able to build one of these incredibly amazing looking silicone replicas of something in a painting, who is able to speak to you and is able to ask you things and respond to things that you ask it, that is immediately adjacent to the work that it's trying to talk about. And that will be strange, because you'll be like, Mona, why are you smiling, Mona? So and she would give you some kind of answer, and it would be, incredibly realistic. And I suspect somewhere somebody's going to do that. And what does that mean to works of art? These are all huge questions. They're not. You can't answer these questions about what they mean. They're a part of life. You're never going to get rid of it. But I think the reason for talking about it in this audience is for us to at least take a moment to think about it and see what it means to all of us, not just here in Omaha, but around the world. And that leads to the next question, which is rhetorical for sure. There is no answer to this question. But is a museum a place for art with people in it, or is it a place for people with some art in it? Right? That's what frames almost all of these discussions and evolution of museums in the last 50 years. These days, it tends to be a place for people with a little bit of art in it, maybe. And in the old days, it used to be a place for art, and maybe you'd let some people inside. So it's kind of gone the full spectrum. And where we're looking at next, which is probably the more important question, what will museums be after now? That's something we can talk about. The first thing we should address is how people experience art. Most of those examples that I gave aren't about people and art. And I've been very privileged to work with great curators and directors, Jack Becker notwithstanding, amazing, allows you to understand art in a way that most architects don't have the opportunity. And what we have is a situation where as an individual and you see a work of art, it's an existential experience. And I can vouch for that fact across all kinds of populations, because many years ago, I remember I was having to deal with a family member who was basically turned into a problem, drug addict, all kinds of things, and there were people taking advantage of her, pimps, and it was rough. And I had to find her in an alleyway in Seattle, surrounded by all these pretty serious people. And I was trying to figure out how I was going to extract her from this group, and it wasn't easy. I thought, I was just near the Seattle Art Museum, and I said to all of them, hey, let's go to the art museum. They're like, huh? What you talking about? I said, no, let's do it, man. I'll pay for the tickets. You don't have to worry about it. And I don't care. Let's just go. I walked them over to the art museum. They walked inside, and I'm telling you, from the moment they started to see things, the transformation was immediate. They calmed down. They started to talk in a different way. The power of art just overwhelmed them. So it is an existential experience, no matter who you are or what your worldview is. You just got to get them in there first. And once you get them in there, more people show up. So you're having your solitary existential experience, and then other people are like hanging around you. You kind of try not to focus on them, but it's impossible because people are all looking at the same thing, and they're having their own individual existential experiences while you are having your own unique approach to whatever it is you're looking at. And that's happening very quickly often. So what that creates is a society of people. So all of you might be having unique experiences, but it's joined together by your proximity and the thing you're looking at. So a true work of art starts to allow you to be yourself and allow you to connect to other people. And then you start to think about it in a very unique way, and you start to move. You move around, and everybody's going like this, and they go like that, and they're seeing this existential world from different perspectives. And then after that, everybody splits up. And then goes their next experience. So if you're, maybe two of you are together, but the other people are not, and they're going to other places. That's the life of a work of art and a human being, if it's really well developed. It's not about virtual reality or anything like that, even though those things are cool. Why does that work? It's because, and most architects don't see this, people are not abstractions. They're real. Actually, the buildings are the abstractions. So in architecture school, you're taught to make a building, make it great, and then we'll put some people in there. I don't know how many, but there's got to be some people in there, and you never really talk about who they are. They don't have names, they just have numbers, they're anonymous. And you cannot think of a work of architecture that way. You must somehow project life into these abstractions that we're told don't exist, and put them into a real sense of existence. So how do we do that in terms of architecture? And how do we define, as I will talk in a moment about defining a museum and a place of learning? There are a number of things that most people get. Doesn't matter where you're from in the world, whether you're from Africa or Asia or from the Americas. These things are common amongst almost all people. One of them is a sense of place. You look for a world that you can understand, especially today when the world around us is so chaotic and so frightening. You connect to your home. So finding a place that feels like home is important. The next thing are the visceral qualities of things we create. Texture, what you can touch, light. And the thing that you can touch is a big one in a museum, because a museum is the place where you're told, don't touch anything. If you touch that, I'm calling the police, or an alarm goes off. But people need to touch things, so you make other things that they can touch, so they feel connected. Light is obviously important. Moving. You need to be able to move to feel you're a part of a place. Creating the garden or creating the landscape helps people connect to the world around them. Gathering as a social condition is an important part of architecture. And finally, last and certainly not least, the art is number one. Like, you can do all that stuff, but if the art gets lost, it's no longer powerful and immediate. So the first quick project I'll run through is a San Francisco Museum of Modern Art that we made. It's a rather exceptional building that looks almost like a cliff. It attracts seagulls regularly into it. It's the only horizontal building in downtown San Francisco. Everything else is vertical. It has this very unusual facade, which almost feels like the ripples of clouds or fog. And we were inspired by the maritime climate in San Francisco. And I often say that the fog is the busiest thing in San Francisco. Like, nothing works as hard as the fog there. And it's constantly shifting, and you see the city in new ways. And we wanted to evoke that character because San Franciscans, the people within 15 minutes of the museum, will get it. And so in addition to designing these ripply facades, we gave it a certain kind of texture, a beautiful texture which you can touch, you can stand, people can see you standing in the texture, and you can actually feel it. So many people go to that wall, in the few places you can touch it, is rub their hands across it. This was not somebody I know, this was somebody I didn't know, just touching the facade, because texture and touch are so important to people. The other thing about it is movement. You need to move in museums. If you don't move, you're only getting a kind of sort of mild understanding of what a place can be. So we made stairs that are accessible. We also looked at the history of the museum and the collections of the artists that they had, including this amazing Diebenkorn. Is it Diebenkorn? It's not Thibaut, is it? Is it Diebenkorn or Thibaut? What? Thibaut. Sorry about that. One of my favorite artists. I'm sorry I got that wrong. I'm a little tired. The way everything is foreshortened. And so the stairs became foreshortened. And when people in San Francisco go there, they feel that they're in the city, walking up and down the hills. Sometimes the stairs let you off and you get views. You have places to sit, places to look outside. All of these things are important to existing in the museum. Daylight, fresh air, all of those things. We created, it's in a city, so you can't really have a garden. It's not like Minneapolis where you just have like huge gardens in front of the museums. This was in a very tight urban space, so we just made a vertical garden, and people go out and they experience art in relation to nature in different times of temperature during the year. You can see that garden from the inside. That makes a connection. And before you get to that garden, you have a place of gathering in the lobby, which is, you can see unfortunately the lighting is a little harsh, but the garden is just on the other side of those windows up there. And you move through art, you collect in a very special way around and through art, and then you move to the galleries, and each of these galleries in San Francisco are so carefully tuned using we talked with artists, we talked with curators, the directors, the people that are in charge of hanging. All of those people collaborated with us, our engineers, our acousticians, all of that. And you'll see when I talk about Joslyn, these same things came through. A couple of other quick projects, I'll just go through them fast. We made a central library in Canada, in Calgary. It's really well known for this rather unusual shape and its facade. And people always ask us, how did that come to be? I do know this, though, that when I talk to a Calgarian and they go to the building, they say, wow, I feel at home here. It feels at home in its place. And they wonder why. Well, part of that process was the same kind of process we had in San Francisco. There's a meteorological event called a Chinook cloud, which is two areas of pressure meeting, and they make this massive arch of clouds that can go for hundreds of miles. So we built this form around that. It's not a cloud, but it feels like it. And you can see as the building lifts up, it creates that sense that you're somehow moving through an arch. And we made lots of places you can touch in the library, not the books themselves. Artwork that was made deliberately to be touched, and people do that. The quality of light in this building is sometimes harsh and sometimes soft. And as you move through it, you're always moving through different characteristics of light. The most impressive for me is the walkway along the edges, which gets this reflected light, and it just bounces back and forth, and it's as if you're in a kaleidoscope, and that just moves you through the building. There's a massive atrium inside with a giant skylight at the top, and it just swirls around you when you walk in, and that atrium is filled with stairs that invite you to walk up them, and it's amazing how many people will walk up a good stair. They wouldn't walk up a bad stair, but they'll walk up a good stair. We're doing a museum, a children's museum in El Paso. It's under construction, nearly finished. It's called La Nube, which means the cloud in Spanish. And our development of that project, again, was based around something people were familiar with there. The clouds in the desert are quite special. And one of the things we noticed was that, of course, this is a border town. El Paso borders with Juarez. And for the last 20 years, it's extremely difficult for anybody to cross the border, even though they have family on both sides and all of that. My wife, Elaine, who is from there, and just she's seen the change of what the border means. There's only one thing that anybody can figure out that isn't controlled by any government and doesn't have to show its passport, and that's a cloud. They cross the border every day, and nobody says anything. And sometimes they sit on both sides of the border. This is the so-called Rio Grande here in El Paso. So that became a theme, and it was built around that idea, and it's for kids. So, you know, you can have a lot of fun when you're designing for kids. And this animated cloud became the idea for it, and it's really taken off. It's not finished yet, but they're already promoting it and its relationship to the sky and the clouds in a unique way. If you go on their website, they've made all kinds of funny cloud animations to direct the understanding of people to the building. The windows are really special because they're fun shapes, but when you look out them, and El Paso has wonderful skies, you get the clouds framed by the windows. The interior of the building was built around an understanding of vegetation, the cactus, the cholla cactus, the poppies that grow there, and other kinds of things, so that the inside would feel that it was connected to all these colors that people will know in the landscape. There won't be fake flowers, there won't be, nothing about this tells you what it is, but people can feel it. The more sort of slightly on the edge you are of imposing an idea, the more people like it. If you just tell them what it is right away, they don't like it. We made the National September 11th Memorial Museum in New York City, which we started in 2004. It's a project that's filled with trauma. People, everyone who worked on the project with me were in the building or near the building when they collapsed. I was in an airplane landing at JFK Airport that very morning. We never made it. I looked out the window and saw the second plane hit the second tower while I was in an airplane. I had no idea what it was. It just was weird. Anyway, we talked with family members who lost husbands and sisters and daughters and brothers. And one of the things we tried to create was the sense of the present. If the memorial was about the past, our building would be about feeling yourself now. So we created a facade that captures light, shows light in different ways, and as you move around it, it's always giving you daylight. Even at night, it's a very special technique we used on the stainless steel that can capture ambient light. For example, this is the north facade of the building, so it never gets direct sunlight, but it's constantly giving off light, and that's all done without electricity. And there's a great feeling that people have connecting to that. We just opened a project in Austin, Texas, which was also a renovation and refurbishment of a museum. It's called the Blanton Museum. Perhaps the most expressionist piece of that project is a series of canopies that are in the garden. We did not design the building, another company did, but it was very little used. Almost no one went to the Blanton Museum for years. It had an amazing collection, but nobody could see it, or they didn't understand what was there. So by creating these canopies that are bold and suggestive, we were able to create a new identity for the museum. I have to say, from my perspective, it was a real treat for me because this is on a university campus, and when you build on a university campus, they won't approve anything that's not normal. So we came to them with this idea, and they were like, And then the director of the museum had this great idea. She said, let's call you an artist, because you can make art, and they won't question it, and it's not under the same rules. So I got the commission to be an artist, and I made this thing, and now it's there, because they couldn't say no, because it was art. So that was a kind of a fascinating story. But the canopies are really wonderful. They shade people. People go there now. It's changed completely the visitorship of the museum. People go there on Saturdays, on weekends, to go outside and enjoy the garden. They also go inside. We did a few interventions like that yellow upside-down arch that has an auditorium in it. And the reaction is just, for me, it's so spectacular. I go there anytime I go. This was one time, something new. This was a whole sketch club, like the Austin Urban Sketch Club, they were called. And they would go there once a month to sketch the canopies. They have kids that are there. You never saw kids there before. And people are on date nights, of course, but it's not in the museum, it's outside the museum, so that interesting challenge. And we had to work with some significant artworks. This is Ellsworth Kelly's last project before he died in the background there. It's called Austin, and we needed to frame that in a way that was sensitive to it. While we were working on that, Carmen Herrera was given a commission to make a mural in the existing building that we had to coordinate. And while we were working on that with her, she died. So I've told artists, try not to work with us if you're, like Ellsworth died while we were working on it, and Carmen Herrera died. But it was magnificent. We got to work with them both. And this is a beautiful, beautiful piece in the loggia of the older museum. The last project I'm going to show before I finish with Joslyn is the commission for us to build the Theodore Roosevelt Presidential Library in North Dakota. It's the first presidential library for a deceased president in the country. It's situated in a place where Theodore Roosevelt went when he was a young man. He had no political ambitions whatsoever. He had just lost his wife and his mother by 2 different diseases on the same day, Valentine's Day in 1884. He was distraught. And he went to this place in North Dakota and he rebuilt himself. He improved his health. He created his political ambitions. He invented conservation movement, didn't exist before him out there. So we're working with that project and in a direct way with the landscape. So the library is as much about the building, which, by the way, a presidential library is actually a museum. So it's gone back to what they were in ancient Greece. There's almost no books there. There's a few, but basically a lot of artwork and history, things like that. But the landscape becomes the library. The landscape becomes the museum. There are places to gather and collect, and there are places to touch. This is a rammed earth wall, which is being built from soil in the area. So they're taking the dirt that is existing in Medora and hammering it into a wall. So when you touch it, you'll be touching all the soil from different places nearby. You probably know this project from us, the National Ballet and Opera in Oslo. It's a great segue to where we're going. Many people have seen this image of the building. You can walk up on the roof. It sort of comes down into the water, and people always wonder why or how did we invent this shape. Most people don't know this, rarely discussed, but actually we were trying to make it look like a swan. And there was a swan in the Oslo fjord that used to swim in this site before the building was built, and we were always just impressed by it. And there were more than one swan, several of them, and they're so beautiful, even though they're mean and angry, but they're really beautiful. And we thought, wow, and you can see, I think if you squint your eyes, there's something there. But of course, nobody would believe that. They said, no, it's a glacier. I know it was a glacier. So we had to finally give in and say, yeah, okay, it's a glacier, even though we didn't think about that. So there's this feeling that somehow it represents the national identity of Norway with this glacier. And that led us to build a series of associations that people brought by themselves to the project. And so the last thing we'll talk about is Joslyn. Is my time up? I heard an alarm. Because I can stop. I just won't show Joslyn. And so what I'm going to talk about Joslyn for the next 15 minutes is just simply the opening date. I have several slides. No, I'm not talking about the opening date. But anyway, I know many of you have that on your mind. It's been closed a long time, and it's such a wonderful place. It's hard to see it closed for so long. The new project is not just this pavilion that we're building here in color. It's also a refurbishment of the existing buildings and a redefinition of the gardens and outdoor sculpture spaces. So it's a big project, much bigger than the galleries that we're creating. There's an entry area that you can see in blue there. I think this works. Nearby, there's a shop and a community room we'll talk briefly about, places to sit, and a way to move up to the galleries or through and into the existing atrium building that you probably all well remember. If you go up the stairs, you'll find this series of galleries that are part of the new wing, and they'll show new works that the building was in a way built for, along with other works of the collection. You'll be able to go into the memorial building and, of course, to the 1995, I believe it is, building. Is it 95? Anybody remember? 94, yeah. Because I lectured in Witherspoon before it was built, I remember. It was not long before that. And their construction hadn't started when I was there. But anyway, the majority of the galleries, new galleries, are upstairs alongside all the existing galleries. So how did we conceive of it? You heard about the swan and everything. We wanted the museum to be a place that people understood somehow intuitively, even if they didn't understand the story. Well, when we talked about Nebraska, I had traveled many times across Nebraska, and like many people, you get to see Chimney Rock, and it's really spectacular thing just growing out of the plains. And this was a pretty powerful image in my mind that never went away. And the first time I saw Joslyn, I thought it's almost like that. It's just this powerful piece of rock that's rising up into the sky. But as important as Chimney Rock is to the development of this project, Scotts Bluff is actually perhaps even more interesting to look at in relation to our building. It had this kind of colonnaded cliff-like feeling, and if you put the two together, I think you can see with the stair coming down and the rubble from Scotts Bluff. We just need to set up a few Calistoga wagons or whatever they're out front, and it'll be almost the same. But somehow that just kept pressing on us, that people understood this in Nebraska, and it would be something they'd link to, the way they did to the Joslyn. Even the 94 pavilion has this feeling as though it's a block of quarried stone or something like that, this pink, beautiful sort of block of stone. So we moved through the geologic understanding of Nebraska, and then we passed that up and then started to talk about the weather. And Nebraska, like the last few days, can have beautiful days, beautiful blue sky, and delicate clouds floating by, and it can be pretty great, especially when you're on the plains and, it's just like an ocean of grass and this ocean of sky. But that's not the only kind of weather you have in Nebraska. Of course, you have some pretty serious weather that you need to run away from real quickly or go into a basement. The power of that movement of these storms and these clouds, it's amazing, right? So what if instead of doing the same conceptual idea that the Joslyn Memorial had and the 94 Pavilion had by Norman Foster, which are firmly related to the earth, what if we lifted everything up and created this dynamic movement of weather, and the building somehow could be this swooping cloud that moved across the landscape, and it's lifted up off the ground, the building, as though it were a cloud, and it has this very unusual facade that feels as though it's in movement, and it will, because as the sun moves over it, the shadows are changing. As you move across it, the shadows will change. In the different seasons, it will change. So it's going to always feel moving. So putting the two together is a kind of concept that we had. Again, most people will not notice that, nor will they care. Or they'll make up something else, like, it looks like a piano or an accordion or something like that. It's not important where that came from, but it was interesting to us. And that was shown really clearly in some of the drawings we made. The next idea is museum as texture and light. And the texture from that facade is attractive to people. So if you look at the Joslyn or any other great work of classical historical architecture, which I love, I'm a modern architect, but I love these older great buildings, you'll see they're filled with texture. Texture on the bottom, on the top, things move everywhere. There's a shade and shadow and stuff in and out. We can't do that. I mean, I don't think Jack or the museum would be happy if we made like cherubs on the building or something like that, or eagles going like that. But the concept is still the same, that somehow it feels like it's got things happening. Once you're inside, there's all kinds of places that are filled with natural light. And then really, in a way, you'll walk in and you'll just, and today and the last few days, it was just enormous to see all the light flowing into this new structure. And you're inside. It's not like, there was always light in the existing buildings, but it either came from above or it was outside. Rarely could you see it directly from inside. So this is part of the new atrium that will be an extension of the old atrium that leads you to the entry. And as you move around the spaces, you're able to see light from above. You move towards the light. You move past the light. These are things that have never existed in the museum. And all of that light and texture brings you to a sense that you need to move. Whether you're in a wheelchair or walking on your feet, you feel like you want to move somehow. It's just asking you to move. And it's not just the art, which is an important part of moving, because if you see a work of art that's great, you just are, it's like a magnet. But before you get to all that, you need to feel that you're in a building you feel comfortable moving around in. So we've made all kinds of targets outside. When you arrive, there'll be a beautiful little garden with a view through the building, actually, to the south and to the west. And there'll be works of sculpture that you feel you might understand later. And so as you move into the building, by the way, I should mention, to enter the building, we'll talk more about that. You walk under the museum, and it's this massive cantilever geologic cliff that even scares me a little bit. So, but that's okay. Life isn't all perfect. So you feel this thing, and then you move through that thing, past the sculpture, and you immediately the volumes open up to about 30 feet high, with daylight coming from all sides. So it's a sense of compression and a sense of uplifting. You move up a series of stairs. You see the sculpture that you saw as you entered. The entry is real clear. Nobody will ever be asked ever again where's the entry to the Joslyn? So I think the staff will be happy for that. And we'll be able to remove all those signs that says, are you looking for the art? It's a very clear kind of idea. The other thing that's interesting is the relationship of the color of the building and how it related to the gardens and the big steps and all of those things. We sort of redefined the outdoor space to become a series of smaller, intimate experiences, and that would lead you to an understanding of the garden, but also more importantly, the way the building connects to the Joslyn itself is a very, very delicate moment. I can't remember how long we worked on that detail, but it was easily several years. And you're able to be in a more kind of open space that's relatively flat. So the museum as a garden is important to us, and you have great landscape space, open space around the Joslyn. So we actually leveled the big area where people often have weddings and other things. It used to actually slump. It kind of went like this, and now it's going to be really clean and flat. There's a garden there down in the lower right. It's a new type of garden. There are other spaces we'll talk about adjacent to the building and the community room. So here's a kind of general view of the garden in the distance. And sorry, I'll just a little detail of the garden at the northwest corner. And here you can see it. It's going to have a lot of native grasses and other things. We'll also, what I should mention is that part of the garden has, we lowered the wall. So this wall right here actually was up here, and it went all the way out here. So that when you drove down Dodge, you couldn't really see the Joslyn anymore. So we've taken that wall down to a lower level, and you'll be able to see the garden, the new structure and everything. You can't see it now because the construction fence is up there, but you'll see it when they take it down. That garden will be filled with delights, and in the spring it'll have new perennials and annuals, and you'll be able to walk through it and smell the flowers. There's a scented garden as well as a visual garden. And the garden that's in the front that I mentioned earlier is also planted in a unique way. You can sit there and wait for your friends near to the entrance. And as you approach the museum from the parking lot, this swooping form holds this new garden, very small garden in place. In winter, we think the gardens will also be very beautiful. They'll be covered in white, quite special. Nearly done. I want to say that it's important that we see the museum as gathering, because Nebraska is known for gathering things. So they brought the trains together, all these things. Nebraskans are a people that like to be with family, all together with friends. So we wanted that to feel there in this building too. The lobby itself allows you to easily gather large groups of people. And as I mentioned, you don't expect it. You walk through this lower thing, and then it pops up again. And here's a place where different types of people will come together. Just nearby is a community room, which allows people to gather in formal ways or informal, but through a room rather than in the lobby. And that's the space there on the right. And it feeds out onto a beautiful garden, which you can see here. It'll be filled with sculpture, not shown in this image, and also landscape. So if you're coming from a community group, you get the best community room in the Great Plains. There's a new kitchen design and a new restaurant design, and if you remember the old cafe, it was kind of dark and imposing. We knocked a hole through the wall, which is that window there, and have a view now to a new terrace that'll be planted. So it'll be much, much brighter and happier, I think, than it was. And this is that wall lowered down, as I was mentioning earlier, and that's roughly the view. You'll see people gathering. It'll transform the way in which people feel they can connect to Joslyn. Almost done. Last thing, very important, as I said earlier, none of this matters if the museum isn't protecting its art. The art has to be the existential experience. We've designed, together with the staff and our expertise from other projects, galleries which we think are pretty close to ideal size for the particular types of art that they'll be showing. Smaller rooms that can be divisible. You can move some of these walls even if they don't get moved very often. They're skylit from above. But they're not just skylit. They need to work in the evenings or when there's no light from the sun. So we also have artificial light up there. There's catwalks. It's very complicated to manage. But this is a rendering of how we were imagining. The lights are bigger than what they are now. But this was an early rendering of what that might be. This is another rendering. These days you can't tell the difference between a rendering and I'll just say it's real. It's already finished. But these beautiful, delicate little baffles that can be lit in the day and at night. This is a detail up there. They're gentle curves. It took a lot of work to get those curves just right. So yesterday we took a tour with members of the staff. So this was just yesterday. There's that big entrance cantilever pushing out over you as you enter the garden that you saw earlier. It's really a kind of monumental, almost a sphinx-like building too, like the original Joslyn. This garden will be exceptional with the sculptures top and the people walking by. You'll see people walking past from that view. When you walk in, the lobby has this moment where it just lifts up, but first you have to get out from under the soffit, and the stairs lead you up. Everyone will take these. I will say that 85-90% of the people will take the stairs. And then when they get there to the top, they can see all three galleries, and they can figure out where they need to go and make their plan for the day. Building a mental map for people is a big sense of ownership. If you feel you know where you are and where you want to go, you're really comfortable. If you don't know where you're going, you get very uncomfortable. Then this is that atrium that we showed earlier with the light coming through it. And even I think this is some staff at Joslyn taking their selfie museum moment. So it's already started. Or I guess this is a Yui or something. Yeah, someone's taking the picture. There are little details that you'll see as the project develops, this beautiful little curve. And then the galleries are starting to take shape, and we can see the baffles and how they're working. And they're really something, when we were in there today, the quality of light, so gentle. And what's interesting is, and we learned this when we worked on other museums, although this is mostly daylit during the day, at night it will use artificial light. But we've carefully placed the artificial light so that it is coming from the same direction as the sun. So you'll think that it's sunlight, as opposed to a whole separate lighting system. It's a kind of trick. We've designed some benches and things. And the last little thing I'll show you is these beautiful little exit signs. These are the best exit signs we have ever made. And that's hard to do in the United States, to make good exit signs. They're very particular. We've been working with Ali Pointer-Mikado, who are our colleague architects here in Omaha, who we've known for years, and they've helped us build most of these details and have really committed to the amazing development of the details. I'm going to stop, but before I do, I have a bonus. This is like the bonus lecture. It's only one little piece, and it's about toilets. Most people overlook toilets, architects especially. And, you know, when you go to a museum or almost any kind of place that you're going to be in for a while, you're going to have to use the toilet. And everyone goes into a toilet in a museum, and most of the time they're forgotten about or nobody cares about them. But I think they're an important part of any experience. A toilet should just be the greatest place to be. And so we've worked a lot with that. In San Francisco MoMA, we created these red toilets. They're all different colors. All the colors came from reviewing their collection, and the colors were taken out of works of art that were in their collection. This was a red color. This became, I think, the world's most Instagrammed toilet for a long period of time. And it's amazing because the door is really boring. It's like this white door, and you walk up and you go in and it's like, ah! But amazingly, your skin always is the right color because this is not light that's making that. It's just reflection. So the lights are actually white light, so your face and everything looks the same color as it would otherwise. In Calgary, we made these beautiful mosaic toilets that the kids like to go in there and just play around, so it's become a play area. So what about Joslyn's toilets? Well, they're going to be special, we hope. You know, the building had this wonderful opening in 1931, and you can imagine when it opened, the cars and the clothes, the gala events of the tuxedos and everything. And we were going to do some crazy stuff, but Jack and the rest of the people said, you know, could we tone it down a little bit? It's got to be. So we thought about it, and it was like, yeah, let's do that. We'll make something kind of formal. So the first thing that came to our mind was a tuxedo, which is very formal. And then we thought about the pink marble on the building, and pink and tuxedos seemed to relate somehow. We didn't quite know how. But I would say as an extension of the tuxedo, you know, a pink evening gown, which would probably someone at the opening of the Joslyn Memorial was wearing a pink evening gown, and certainly people were wearing tuxedos. So this is kind of an interesting kind of narrative about the toilets. It's like opening night at the Joslyn. And if we look at the collection, even in this a Currier and Ives collection, part of it from the Joslyn, the man's clothes and her clothes, at least on my screen here, are more black and pink. And it just seemed like this wonderful play of folly. So the buildings are pretty simple. The toilets, you walk in, they're pretty dark, they're like a tuxedo. But as soon as you open the doors, it's going to be pink. So it's going to be rather impressive. So we're expecting people will enjoy the toilets in between the work. So building the right museum means you have to take care of all of these things, and we're so proud to be here tonight and so proud to be a part of this adventure. Joslyn's a very important building for everybody I know. So thank you, and that's that. I don't know if I talked too long. Yeah, I'll take some questions. Yeah, one or two. I think we have time for a couple of questions.
Just we have time for 2 questions, I was told.
Oh, there's one there. I'll repeat it, so you just yell it and I can repeat it.
Right, it strikes me. You obviously have a lot of commissions. As a firm, it's always a two-way street when you're trying to select an architect, and conversely, when a firm is trying to select who they want to work with. What criteria does Snøhetta use when they go about choosing who to work with?
Sure. Well, we're interested in culture, public space, generosity, all of those things. And that's not limited to cultural buildings. A commercial building can have a consequence also. So we like to talk to people who feel they have those same values. It's not that we don't care about, for instance, a commercial building. Money is always going to be important, and nobody discredits that. Financial sustainability is very important, but it has to be backed by a sense of social responsibility. And if we can find that common ground, that's very important. And with the Joslyn, we really felt comfortable when we came in for the interview, although I was scared to death, and I didn't think we'd win it, actually. But, there was a sense that people wanted to do something out of their heart, and that we really felt that. So that's the kind of things we look for. We rarely have any problems. I've had one or two where we've walked away because there were some evil things, but other than that, it's always been a great ride. We have an angel on our shoulders. We're very fortunate. One more or something? My favorite color is blue. Oh, there's one back there.
Craig, can you touch on your view of architecture as art? Whether
Sure.
it's art.
Okay. Yeah. The question is, can architecture be art, or vice versa, can art be architecture? No, the answer is they can't be the same. That doesn't mean they're not related. They're just very distant cousins from different fathers or something. They seem to be the same. Same with music. Everyone loves to compare music. I mean, yeah, of course, you can build metaphors and similes, and they all have relationships in the mind, but they are very different things. I've worked as an artist. I was an artist before I became an architect, until they made me an artist for the Blanton Museum. But other than that, I remember the feeling, and I wasn't a good artist, not because I didn't want to be. I mean, the reason why I didn't become an artist was because I called my dad up, and I said, "Dad, I want to be an artist," and he loved art, and I thought he'd be happy as a happy dog, and he was very unhappy. And I said, "Well, why are you unhappy?" And he said, "Well, son, any artist worth their salt would not call their father up and ask them what they think about it." So clearly you don't have it, right? So I remember saying, "Well, what can I do? Because I don't know what else to do." And he said, "Well, you like art and you like science. Architecture is the mix of those two things, and besides, an architect would probably call their father up and ask what they thought about it." So in a way, that sort of showed me what it was. And I worked with artists over the years. I still work with artists. I'm always working with artists. Artists can do things, especially artists that work in big things, but they don't always know how to get it done. And an architect can do that. And I found when I work with artists, they treat their thing, whatever it is they're doing, as if it were a living, breathing creature. It's not a separate thing. Like, if they finish a painting and you say, yeah, that's great, but could you, do one of those? It's like asking somebody to, like, move a nose on their baby. It doesn't work. And architects are the exact opposite. We're hired to solve problems, hopefully not create them. But, we're used to changing and erasing and moving and rethinking and all of that. That's why they're wildly different, even though art can be architectural and architecture can be artistic, but never can the two be the same. All right.